We've left it out for somehow the last couple of times. Good job. And happy Hanukkah. Last Sunday at sundown, Hanukkah began, and today is the 8th and last day of it. I wonder how many of you celebrate Hanukkah at home each year? Very many people? A handful, a few. Yeah, and I talked to a couple this morning on the way in as well. How about this? How many people here were raised Jewish? Anybody? Couple? Not quite as many. Interesting. Okay. Very good. When I was growing up, my mom taught me about Hanukkah, and I remember singing the dreidel song. You guys know that one? Dreidel, 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 I made it out of clay, and when it's dried and ready, then dreidel we shall. Yes, great. And we played with the dreidel too. We weren't Jewish though. We were Unitarian Universalist. I was raised in this denomination, and I learned the song at my UU church. Unitarian Universalism is technically a Protestant religion, and I don't mean, though, that we are a Christian denomination. Although there are many Christian UUs, most don't identify that way these days, and some UUs identify with other major world religions, such as Hindu UUs or Jewish UUs. When I say that we're Protestant, I mean it in the sense that if you trace our tradition back through its roots, it goes right to the Reformation in the 1500s. That's when the teachings of the then very dominant Roman Catholic Church were challenged, and people started their own churches in protest, hence the name Protestant. However, if you can trace it back that far, of course, you can trace it back even farther. You can trace our tradition's roots back to Jesus, and here's where it gets interesting. While other Protestant religions plant their flags right there in Jesus, Unitarian Universalism looks back even further, and we embrace our Jewish roots too. Some would point out that Jesus also embraced his Jewish roots. He was Jewish after all, and there's no evidence that he thought of himself as starting a new religion. In the bylaws of our denomination, it lists 6 major sources for our faith, including direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder, the words and deeds of prophetic women and men, humanist teachings that counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life, and wisdom from the world's religions, including the Jewish and Christian teachings from which our own tradition developed. So it is fitting that we should talk about Hanukkah, and it is lovely that Jewish UUs, of which there are many in the world, should also maintain their Jewish traditions while being part of this faith. We embrace and celebrate the beautiful diversity of our people and our sources of wisdom. But I would bet that most of us, while we are familiar with it, don't actually know a lot about Hanukkah. Did you know, for example, that there are at least 3 explanations for how Hanukkah came to be what it is today? 2 can be found in scriptures, and 1 arose not in the written tradition but in culture among the people over time. The first is a military story that we find in the books of the Maccabees. Now, an interesting thing about the books of the Maccabees is that while they tell a story that is part of Jewish tradition, and you can find them in many Christian Bibles, you will not find them in the Torah, the sacred canon of Jewish scriptures. They are non-canonical in Judaism. The story they tell starts with a familiar scenario from ancient times. The people of Israel are under foreign rule. They had been for hundreds of years since the Babylonians forced them into exile and destroyed their first temple, the one that had been built by Solomon, the son of King David himself, 600 years before the Common Era, BCE. Later, the Persians defeated the Babylonians, and being more open to religious diversity, they allowed the Jews to rebuild their temple. Then along came Alexander the Great, a Greek, and then the Greek dynasty known as the Seleucids, and they ruled over the Israelites. I should say Israelites and not Jews when telling this story, because the Jewish people didn't become known as Jewish until later. First, they were the Israelites. Under the Seleucid Empire, for a time, the people were still allowed to follow their own religions then, too. That was common Greek practice. But then a Seleucid emperor came to power, Antiochus IV, who had different views. And he started to crack down, forcing the Israelites to follow Greek religious practices. The story of the Maccabees takes place in the 2nd century BCE under Antiochus's oppression. Now, Antiochus didn't burn down the temple again, but maybe what he did was just as bad. He built an altar to Zeus inside it and ordered the people to make sacrifices to Zeus instead of the God of Israel. Now, another interesting thing about the ancient Near East is that up until the time the Babylonians destroyed the Israelites' first temple, people pretty much always interpreted military victories as acts of gods. There were believed to be many different gods. Even Judaism acknowledged this. Even the people of Israel acknowledged this. And that's why in the 10 Commandments it is written not that there is only one God, but that the people of Israel should not put any other gods above their own. It's an acknowledgement of the polytheism of the time. It was the custom in that part of the world that when one group defeated another, the gods of the victors had also defeated the losing side's god. And so it was normal for the defeated group to therefore convert to the religion of the winners. With the people of Israel, though, it was different. When their temple was defeated and they were exiled, they made the incredible change from being a location-based faith to being a faith that is practiced in people's homes and hearts, a faith that goes with the people. For this reason, it would have been impossible for Antiochus to truly stamp out the religion of the Israelites, hard as he might try. It was not as easy as banning public practices or ruining a temple space. So there was a mixed reaction among the people. Some went along with Antiochus's demands, in public at least. Others just tried to avoid confrontation on the matter, and some resisted furiously. Among those, the leader of the resistance was a man named Mattathias. It is said that Mattathias' first rebellion occurred when a group of officers in the temple tried to force the people of Israel to conduct one of those pagan animal sacrifices to Zeus. Mattathias was appalled. He raised his voice and shouted, "Even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him and have chosen to obey his commandments, every one of them abandoning the religion of their ancestors, I and my sons and my brothers will continue to live by the covenant of our ancestors. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left." And then he couldn't believe his eyes. No sooner had he finished making this declaration than one of his fellow Israelites stepped forward and did as the king's officers had asked. He made a sacrifice to Zeus, right there in front of Mattathias. The text says that Mattathias burned with zeal, and he gave vent to righteous anger. He killed the man right there on the altar. And he killed one of the king's officers, too. And he tore the altar down. Mattathias and his followers then fled to the hills, where they organized themselves as an insurgent army. They observed nonviolent Israelites refusing to take up arms and being killed by the king's soldiers. In response, they decided that they would fight back with all their might. But they didn't just fight the king. They continued to fight their fellow Israelites who were not practicing the same level of resistance. Mattathias and his followers killed their neighbors, who they felt were not towing the line, and they forcibly circumcised all of the uncircumcised Jewish boys they found, circumcision being one of the practices that Antiochus had banned. He grew enough of an army that although he could not defeat the empire, for the rest of his life, Mattathias managed to continue his campaign using essentially guerrilla tactics. On his deathbed, Mattathias compared his actions to those of Israel's venerated ancestors, and he encouraged his sons to continue what he had started, listing numerous examples from Scripture of people whose faith was tested and who persevered and became great leaders. His son Judas followed in his father's footsteps, becoming the next leader, and the people called him Judas Maccabee, which means Judas the Hammer. Eventually, in the year 168, Judas succeeded in driving the Seleucids from Jerusalem, a fight which was called the Maccabean Revolt. After that victory, Judas returned to the defiled temple, took down the altar to Zeus, and built a new one according to the law of the people of Israel. Then he declared an 8-day celebration, and he called it a time of Hanukkah, which means a time of dedication. That's the Hanukkah story that's written down in the book of Maccabees. That's story number 1 this morning. Now, another source, the rabbinical record of stories called the Talmud, tells us that something more happened during those 8 days of dedication. Story number 2. The Talmud says that during those 8 days, the people lamented that they didn't have any consecrated olive oil for the sacred flame that should burn on the altar. And unlike the Catholic process of making holy water, which is very quick if you've ever seen that happen, it was not a quick process to properly consecrate olive oil. Actually, it was going to take exactly 8 days, exactly too many days to be helpful for Hanukkah. Well, the temple was a mess after all those years under Seleucid control, and it turned out that as they were cleaning it, someone did find 1 jar of consecrated oil. 1 jar, enough for just 1 day, and I'm sure you do know what happened next. That 1 jar lasted not just 1 day, but all 8. It was a miracle of faith, and it's commemorated in the lighting of the 8 candles on the menorah. Story number 3 is the cultural story. That's what happened over time as the people celebrated this holiday year over year. It's the addition of new traditions. Some aren't really that new. The dreidel is a tradition that predates Hanukkah, actually, but it became associated with the holiday. And others really are new, eating latkes, for example, and giving gifts. One thing we should remember is that Hanukkah is actually a relatively minor holiday in Judaism. Although it happens around the same time as Christmas, which is the mother of all holidays in Christianity and in secular America, it's not the Christmas of Judaism. My friend and colleague Paul Sawyer points out that we who are not Jewish would do a better job of honoring our Jewish friends and neighbors if we remembered to wish them Happy New Year at Rosh Hashanah and honored their fasts on Yom Kippur or celebrated with them at Passover. Duly noted. But that isn't to say that the holiday is unimportant. And perhaps in this place, in this time, in this culture, this moment in our history, we should pay extra special attention to it. I don't know about you, but as I heard the military story of Hanukkah, the story of the Maccabees, the extreme tactics of Mattathias and his followers reminded me of other, more modern kinds of extremists in a lot of ways. It's clear from the way the story is told in Scripture that its author was a champion of the Maccabees, and they're presented as heroes. When I was a student at Harvard Divinity School, the HarperCollins Study Bible was the version of the Bible recommended for classes due to its scholarly footnotes. And in its introduction to Maccabees, it also notes that the author was clearly a fan of the Maccabees. And the intro says that the Maccabees are even portrayed as champions of religious freedom. I suppose it says that because the Maccabees resisted Antiochus's efforts to stifle their religion, but actually, you can hear in the story, they really weren't fighting for everyone to have religious freedom. They were fighting for the religion of the Israelites to be practiced in a very particular way, to the point that they imposed it on their fellow Israelites, physically assaulting and even killing them. Religious freedom. We've been hearing that phrase a lot in the news lately. And all too often these days, it's really a demand for the kind of religious freedom, quote unquote, that imposes something on other people. Next spring, for example, the U.S. Supreme Court will hear a case that is framed as being about religious freedom. It was brought by a group called the Little Sisters of the Poor. I've mentioned them before from this pulpit. But its implications go much, much further than that. At stake is the question of whether religious nonprofit organizations that are not churches have to comply with the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, which is also known as Obamacare. Now, religious nonprofits sounds like a quaint phrase, but it includes massive organizations like Catholic hospital chains that employ many thousands of people. The plaintiffs brought the case because they don't want to have anything to do with allowing their employees to access contraception. The ACA says that everyone is entitled to have health insurance coverage for contraception, but it has already provided an out for religious nonprofit organizations that disagree. They just need to make a phone call or fill out a form to let the government know that they're opposed to providing that coverage through their employee health insurance, and then the government will pick up the ball from there and they will provide it directly to the employee, leaving the religious nonprofit out of it. So there's already an exemption they can sign. But what these groups are arguing is that even filling out the form is an infringement on the organization's religious freedom. Of course, if they don't have to let the government know that they're withholding coverage, then the government will not know who to provide it for, making it much harder for those employees and their wives and their daughters, many, many thousands of women, to get contraception. And if you think that's probably not a matter of life and death, consider the enormous health impact and economic impact of giving birth. And consider the fact that a woman spends on average 30 years of her life trying not to get pregnant. And consider the lived reality of a nursing assistant at, say, one of those Catholic hospitals who barely makes enough to get by. My husband and I were both nursing assistants in the early years of our marriage. We made $1.50 above minimum wage, and we qualified for food stamps. Consider a nursing assistant at one of those hospitals today who can't afford another mouth to feed, and who is one paycheck away from being homeless, and who cannot afford contraception out of pocket, especially the most effective contraception, which costs as much as a week's full paycheck. And then tell me that this claim of these conservative organizations for religious freedom does not have life or death consequences for other people. Meanwhile, I keep thinking about that officer who was killed in the Planned Parenthood shooting a few weeks ago. Remember him? He was an evangelical Christian. His church's webpage includes anti-abortion links, but he showed up on that call and did his job and ended up giving his life for it. He did not claim it was an infringement on his religious freedom. It makes the religious freedom claims of businesses and nonprofits seem downright fanatical. And in the end, that kind of fanaticism is not good for anyone. It doesn't square with the values of our country any more than calls to exclude Muslims or admit only Christians. In a recent op-ed, the Rabbi Dov Taylor calls the story of the Maccabees a Pyrrhic victory, which means a victory that inflicts such a devastating toll on the victor that it's actually like a defeat. It was short-lived, he says, and it led to even greater oppression than before. Taylor credits the Maccabean movement with later provoking the Romans, bringing about the destruction of the Jerusalem temple again, the sack of the city, the exile to Rome of the rebels, and the murder of their families. 3 years later, he writes, came the fall of Masada and the mass suicide of its zealous defenders. And finally, the Bar Kokhba revolt put an end to what was left of Jewish life in Palestine for 18 centuries. He says, in their wisdom, the rabbis who canonized the Hebrew Bible knew that zealots of whatever stripe invariably succeed in destroying the very things they claim to be defending. So they kept 1st and 2nd Maccabees out of the Bible, relegating them to the Apocrypha. They invented instead a legend about a bit of oil sufficient for one day's lighting that lasted for 8, and they made a compromise with Hellenism, the Greeks, that created what we know today as Judaism. He continues, in anticipation of the Jewish Festival of Lights, let us remember that zealotry and refusal to compromise is always and everywhere a recipe for destruction. Let us instead be among those who kindle light in a dark time. Now, lest you think I am down on Hanukkah, let me point out that there's a grand tradition in Judaism of lively debate over sacred stories. Texts and stories are continuously interpreted, and what I'm suggesting this morning is that we would do well to pay attention to the violence and consequences of extremism in this story. It could not be more relevant to our times. Paul Sawyer, that friend and colleague of mine, puts it nicely when he says that there are some beliefs worth lighting a candle, worth shining a light for all to see. And he says we should learn lessons from both sides of the Hanukkah story, including, as he puts it, that in the grand conversation of faith in our world, we do not make progress by imposing one form of belief over another through reactionary caveat or even through fiery, righteous preaching of any kind, religious or political. That the pathway to building the beloved community, or at least a world in which we don't spend so much time trying to kill or subjugate one another for our beliefs, is a religiously liberal one. It is a path of opening minds and hearts and providing for possibilities. I couldn't say it any better than that. Our closing hymn this morning is Light One Candle. It's about the Maccabees, as you will see, and especially about their children, whose lives, like those of children everywhere, depend on the wisdom and the mercy of their elders. Please rise in body or in spirit. It's number 221, and Sue will also play this one all the way through.